We're back from the break, y'all. Hope you enjoyed it. Now back to the history poem. The Emperor of the Romans was none other than Charlemagne. Charlemagne was very strong. He practically felt absolutely no pain. He defeated the Saxons who invaded Britain in the past. His empire built some schools. The schools were built fast. Unfortunately, he could not stay with Europe forever. His followers were not as good as him in any ways whatsoever. I don't know about that. They might have been. The Muslims then invaded parts of Italy, Spain, and France. Then along came the Magyars. Boy, Europe didn't stand a chance. Just look at them now. Then came the Vikings, who were from Scandinavia. Their acts were more terrifying than those who invaded Mesopotamia. The Vikings continued to raid Europe. They were destroying and stealing. Their acts were the worst of them all, and they weren't very appealing. I've actually seen much worse than that. The Vikings lasted long, but were soon down on the ground. King Alfred of Wessex drove the Vikings out of town. King Alfred was good, but not the people who came after. The conflict came back to Europe. It was a complete disaster. William the Conqueror was crowned the new king, for he defeated King Harold at the Battle of Hastings. More like the Battle of Wastings. Then King Henry II ruled in England for a very short time. He established a court of law to prove if people committed their crimes. Look at what we have now compared to then. Soon after King Henry II, his son John took the throne. His powers were mean and cruel to others. He later got overthrown. Serves him right. He had to sign the Magna Carta and was relieved of his cruel laws. I feel he should have been killed or even kicked in the face or the jaws. I was 14 when I wrote this. I don't think that. Later on, a new ruler came. He established Parliament. His name was King Edward I of England. He controlled the government. Now the government controls us. Much later, a new ruler came as Philip II of France. He conquered most of France much quicker than ants could crawl up your pants. Much later, a new city formed, and it was called Moscow. Its later ruler, Ivan III, built the Kremlin, which existed all the way till now. Ivan III stopped Mongol rule and stretched the country a little bit more. Then he died much faster than a person could even install a door, or even walk through one. Then along came the Crusades, and then the first colleges were made. The colleges gave the people education and gave them excellent grades. Then the worst thing happened to Europe. The Black Death occurred. The Black Death was a disease that struck many people. This stuff is not absurd. Well, it's not absurd, but look what's happened now. Then after the Black Death stopped, France and England started fighting. The English were winning the war non-stop. They were just as strong as lightning. An overstatement. The English were very strong, but then France finally got their way. The French then won the 100 Years' War and made the English pay. Then later on, Spain and Portugal fought to end Muslim rule. The Muslims were then defeated by Spain, and then all was cool. Then America came along for the very first time in history. America was part of the Ice Age, which still remains a mystery. Americans started farming in Mesoamerica. They did absolutely fine. America started planting tons of crops at the perfect time. The first American empire was built in present-day Veracruz. The empire was called Olmec, and they had so many people amused. They built the first ever planned city in 400 AD. The Americans had built a society that every single person could see. Unfortunately, the Olmec Empire did not last very long. The empire soon faded, just like the ending of a song. Later on, a new empire formed, the This empire was called Aztec. The Aztec Empire copied everything from the Toltec. The Aztec Empire moved into Mexico and took over their place. The empire was so powerful that the Aztecs ate snakes. The Aztecs improved Mexico. They taught them to trade. They taught them many things the Aztecs would never fade. No, they wouldn't. The next empire was to come along was mostly known as an Incan. The Incan Empire was well thought out, a lot more thought out than Lincoln. Next came the Native Americans, better known as Indian tribes. The Indians were very smart. They knew exactly how to live their lives. Christopher Columbus discovered America, thinking he was in the Indies. He thought he was in Asia, home to the country Normandy. Meanwhile, the Aztec Empire started to have conflicts in Spain. The Spanish were causing the conflict, which brought an image to the emperor's brain. The emperor of the Aztecs was none other than Montezuma. He tried to invade Spain, but the Spanish soldiers were faster than pumas. The Spanish outnumbered the Aztecs by so many forces. Montezuma himself was killed a lot faster than 1,000 racing horses. Just imagine what 1,000 bulls could do. Or elephants. The Aztecs were defeated and most of them moved away. Some of them were killed by Spanish and some of them passed away. Meanwhile, in the Inca Empire, trouble was quickly growing. A guy named Francisco Pizarro was just becoming the Inca, not going. It's getting long. Eventually, he defeated the Inca Emperor and had him sentenced to death. The Inca Empire lost everything, but Pizarro was rewarded with wealth. How much of it? Next came the Italian Renaissance. For the next 730 days, the concept of art and learning was reborn in many different ways. Italy was made from a rural country to a new urban town. The time of famous culture was rather rising up, not falling down. The new and improved cities became very rich with a lot of money to store. They had many famous playwrights, artists, and so much more. So many good artists, and so many bad. Many of these plays were shown during the day, for there was no light in which they were to stay. The artists were good too. They made a lot of creations. They used so many things for art, maybe even salivation. Then the time period called Reformation started to come. People started to oppose the church. A lot of people, not just one. I wonder what the church was doing. Well, let's find out. The church was doing stupid things like selling indulgences. The people thought the church was losing all of its intelligences. A guy named Martin Luther started to get real mad and enraged. He worried about what might just happen when he died at a certain age. He then learned about what he had to do in order to go through heaven's door. He searched for answers so many times that sometimes he fell on the floor. And what did he do next? Well, let's find out. Luther then prepared a list of arguments that were called the 95 Theses. The church completely ignored Luther. They thought, we don't really need these. Later on, the church saw Luther as a dangerous man to live. They later kicked him out of the church. They hadn't much to give. The peasants, shocked to hear this, went and read the 95 Theses, then revolted against the church and the nobles that were greedy. Were greedy. The peasants were very strong, but soon were defeated. Then Luther, mad at the loss of peasants, had many things he hated. The now disproven Luther blamed nobles for their actions, but somehow Luther didn't feel like giving an unpleasant reaction. I don't know if he could. It would have hung him. Then a new ruler came along in this poem. He was called Charles V. He became the king of Rome. Sooner or later, the Germans seized control over the lands. Now they were getting wealthy with excess money in their hands. Charles V tried to stop the selfish German kings, but the Germans were too strong, those selfish human beings. They're much better now. Later on, a guy named John Calvin knew a lot about theology. His studies were very amazing, even better than biology or physics. He went on to support Lutheranism and ended up in jail, but was able to get out without being released or even bailed. They'd let anybody out those days. He then added some more ideas and believed in predestination. He was clearly a religious man, very religious! His theory went very well and soon began to spread. This well-thought-out idea got into most people's heads. You should see what gets in people's heads now. Sooner or later, a new era came. It was called Counter-Reformation. The Catholic Church was against Protestantism throughout this big nation. Yes, it was very big. Before it could go to work, it needed to reform in order to fight. A guy named Pope Paul III began to establish new ways of life. First, he established seminaries and extended an earlier form of Christianity. He taught the bishops and priests how to behave and to not use profanity. Much later in life, a civil war was going on. This war took place in France with the Huguenots and the Bourbons. Eventually, King Henry IV became king of Huguenots in France. The war continued because of his religion. France didn't stand a chance. Because the French did not like him as a king, he became a Catholic ruler. The people of France accepted him. He seemed to be so much cooler. Then a new conflict arose. It was called the 30 Years' War. The Catholic king was at one point accepted. Not anymore. The war lasted for 30 years. It was a horrible time for fighting. The war made France a powerful country at very perfect timing. Spain, however, was now affected by this war. Now they were acting suspicious. They were very mean to people who were not Catholic. Boy, they were vicious. Muslims, who had been ruling since the Middle Ages, were soon no longer permitted. Even Jews were not allowed in Spain. They were too forbidden. Soon came the English Reformation. Their ruler was Henry VIII. This ruler was stubborn, cruel, and violent. He obviously had no faith. Not to mention, he had many wives. He was not a nice ruler, but never ever worry, for another mean ruler came along. Her name was Bloody Mary. She was such a cruel and nasty queen that the English were terrified. They gave her the name Bloody Mary, of course, till she died. Her half-sister Elizabeth became the new queen. She was much nicer than Mary, neither violent nor mean. Sooner or later, the Puritans were stopped and convicted for their crimes. Some of the Puritans moved somewhere else in these hard times. Later on, the Jesuits started hating Buddhism and soon started to rebel. They tried to take down Vietnam, but the emperor had them all expelled. Next came the age of exploration, with many different fascinating explorers. The explorers had many new tools like the compass, the astrolabe, and more. Isn't that a mouthful? Some people, however, were too poor to travel and couldn't take a suggestion. People found exploration so confusing, it was like a maze of questions. This time of confusion was soon gone for good. It was finally time to travel. The days of hard work were finally over. No more pounding with shovels. The only problem was that people in different countries argued on where to go. One country wanted to explore it first. Another simply said no. Eventually, Portugal got the chance to explore the new place. A guy named Henry the Navigator led them in their ways. Sugar was then discovered in Africa and very, very expensive. Wait till you see what's nowadays. Eventually, slaves from Africa were shipped in order to make it extensive. Then all of a sudden, a route to Eastern Asia was finally found. An explorer named Vasco da Gama raced across the ocean to find solid ground. Like Christopher Columbus, a guy named Magellan tried to find Asia too. Magellan's voyage was a successful one. It was like deja vu. Later on, John Cabot came along and looked for a northern route. Cabot just simply failed to finish his mission. He was the right man to doubt. A decade later, Jacques Cartier tried harder. He found so many sights, but he didn't find what he was looking for. He got stranded in France. Yikes. I would not want to be stranded in France. Sooner or later, the Spanish fought England. They hoped to get a lot of money, but the English privateers attacked Spanish ships. They seemed to think it was funny. The Spanish soon got tired of England. They built a huge fleet. The Spanish Armada had slow-moving ships. They eventually had to retreat. A natural disaster broke up the Armada. Spain was prone to attacks. The Spanish couldn't fight England anymore. There were very many things they lacked. Next came the Commercial Revolution and this action-packed story. The Spanish and the Portuguese built empires that helped them rise to glory. Other Europeans who saw their huge wealth wanted to do the same for themselves. The idea of mercantilism was founded. It got rid of the need for Santa's elves. Exporting goods and importing goods took a very long time. The people exported more than they imported and spent less money, even less dimes. Most of these products were sent by long distance. They never ever shipped. The rich Europeans invested their money and they never ever got gypped. Sooner or later, the cottage industry began putting anger on merchants' faces. The merchants eventually bought from peasants instead. Boy, these were good places. Then the Columbian Exchange began. People started to trade some stuff. They mostly exchanged their valuable items and ideas, maybe even coughs. This era may have been a successful time, but soon diseases spread. The diseases of measles and other things affected people's bodies, even their heads. Wait till you see the coronavirus. Much later, the scientific revolution began to influence Earthlings. The study of science began to prosper. It became a natural thing. People like Ptolemy and Copernicus took astronomy as a course. Because their theories and opinions were different, this led to many conflicts and wars. Galileo was the next to come in this epic long poem. Galileo's works were brilliant and fascinating, but denied by the Church in Rome. The Age of Enlightenment was the next to come in this historical, fascinating story. It talked about how Thomas Hobbes and John Locke rose to absolute fame and glory. Later on, a guy named Voltaire went against the Church's power. He wanted to change the way life went, either by the minute or by the hour. The next to come was Denis Diderot, who wrote a marvelous book. He went on and on about various subjects and changed people's looks. Much later, a guy named Jean-Jacques Rousseau thought in a different way. He thought that people needed to live simpler lives and have better days. Then during the 1600s and the 1700s, the age of absolutism came. It talked about how monarchs and kings and rulers rose to glory and fame. Then later on, a ruler came to power. King Louis XIV became king. We're getting closer to the end, y'all. Just be patient. He went and fought so many costly wars, then did very many dumb things. Russia then came to power and was ruled by a guy named Peter the Great. He worked to improve Russia's government and made the power up to date. He founded the city of St. Petersburg, but then started to die. After he died, conflict broke out in Russia. It was terrible to see. Why? I think we know why. Sooner or later, a new ruler came. Catherine the Great was next to reign. She was very smart and well-educated, and she was not at all insane. Much later, when colonies were invented, the British became very cruel. They taxed the Americans and controlled their trade and made very many new rules. The colonists were angered by the imposed taxes. They soon began to fight. They soon began to think of new laws and eliminated what was not right. I think you could have done a whole lot better job. Sooner or later, the American Revolution brought the Americans to battle. The British were too strong for the Americans to beat. The Americans had very little. Just 4 more lines, y'all. We can do it. Soon, however, the Americans went to the French. The French helped them score. The British, knowing they could not win, surrendered. The Americans won the war. Well, the end of the chapter is finally here. I hope to do this again. I hope this poem gets published. The only question is, when? Well, now, because it's in the form of a song. Thank y'all. It's Mike the Southern Boy, signing right off.